Compromise and Bloodshed. The Road to the Civil War. Welcome, class. So, if you received this assignment, we are doing this over the break. Now, you should be able to get this through. This is going to be the first in a series of lectures, slideshow dealing with one subject, the road up to the Civil War. So, in our last instance that we did in class, thus far we've talked to you about the antebellum period, abolitionism, economic causes of sectionalism, and the Mexican-American War. Now what we're going to be dealing with is the main escalation of hostilities. How do the North and the South get to the point where they're ready to actually fight and kill each other over the issues of slavery and the status of the South in the Union? So, without further commence. So, one of the first measures to really begin this ball rolling is the Fugitive Slave Law, which is passed first in 1793 by the United States Congress and then is reinvigorated in 1850. So what did it do? Well, what this law did was it required that escaped slaves found in free states be returned to their owners. See, even in the early 1700s, states, especially in the North, that are moving in a more industrialized direction, are starting to roll back the institution of slavery. There weren't many slaves in these territories. Slavery wasn't nearly as vital to their economy, so slavery was disappearing there. So as you had this dynamic of free states versus slave states, the issue came, well, what exactly becomes of an escaped slave, a fugitive slave, living in a free state? Are they a free person? Are they not? What are the prerogatives of their owner, either who had rights to them as property? What is the status of that issue now? And the position of the 1793 Fugitive Slave Law is no. If they're owned as a slave anywhere in the Union, they are to be returned to their owner, even if they are currently residing within a state where slavery is illegal. Now, in the 1850 version of the law, it was reinvigorated. In order to try and get more slaves out of the North, there were a few new provisions. The first provision that I didn't include in the writing here, but you should keep this in mind, is that there were penalties imposed for assisting a fugitive slave. So if you were someone on the Underground Railroad, if you were someone who was helping an escaped slave get to freedom or stay hidden from their captors, you could face fines or even jail time for doing so. Additionally, there was a rather disturbing provision in the law that, when an individual was captured, there would often be a trial of sorts. The reason for this is there would be a dispute, right? If you're captured and you're a runaway slave, the first thing you're going to do is you're going to deny that you're the right person. You're going to say, no, I'm a free black person. I'm not a slave. So how do you get to the bottom of this, right? There's no photo ID, there's no social security back in these days, no fingerprinting. So how do you get to the bottom of this issue of who is an escaped slave and who actually is a free person who's being questioned mistakenly? So there would be a sort of trial. All right, so far so normal. Here's where the normalcy stops. In this provision, a judge would get double if the individual was deemed to be a slave and was returned south, as opposed to if they were deemed to be a free person and was allowed to stay in the North. Now, from one position, you can understand why someone might have envisioned the law this way. The assumption being that there would be a pro-abolitionist bias in the North, so to use this double pay as a sort of counterweight to that assumed moral bias. The problem is, in doing it this way, you've given the judge a financial motivation to deem that person a slave, because they get paid double for making such a ruling. So many free individuals ended up actually being wrongfully sent to the South as slaves. So, next, why the Fugitive Slave Law was so inadequate. Well, one reason is abolitionists continue to harbor slaves anyway. since the conviction of the abolitionist is that this is a moral issue, that this is an issue of a higher law, as many consider, they consider this issue of divine justice. Remember, we're in the age of fundamentalism at this point. We're in the age just coming out of the Great Awakening. These people are invigorated biblical Christian fundamentalists who are on a crusade to make the United States mirror divine law as they see it. And by that standard, even the Constitution is subject to a literalist interpretation of the Bible and is subservient thereto. So as a result of that, if they feel morally that slavery is an abomination, they're going to continue ignoring the law, just as they did before. The other issue is that attempts to recapture fugitive slaves often ended with the kidnapping of free people of color who were captured and then illicitly enslaved. The other issue is that it's actually led to a very early issue of resentment between the North and the South. That was one issue, right? To the northern states, this was an intrusion on their communities and on their way of life by individuals who were acting as agents of other states. Right? This is the federal, if you're in New York or Massachusetts, this is the federal government and the collective South poking their noses into your communities and your way of life. The other issue is this also led to an estrangement between people of color and the criminal justice system. For example, down in the right-hand corner of the screen, you'll notice there's a poster that appeared in a town in Boston, and it says, "Fugitive slaves. Attention, the slave hunter is among us. Be on your guard. And arrest is planned for protect. Be ready to receive them whenever they come." In other words, they're warning these people, hey, watch out. There are people in your midst who are trying to enslave you. And these notices would be seen in almost every city. And as a result of this, it often caused people of color to shun interactions with policemen and the night watches of cities, fearful that these individuals empowered by the Fugitive Slave Act would end up actually simply trying to arrest and enslave them. So then we had the Missouri Compromise. So what is the deal with the Missouri Compromise? Well, it was passed in 1820, and the issue of it was dealing with the issue that as more and more population built up in the West, the next issue was, what do we do with these Western states? When they enter the Union, are they going to be free states or slave states? So what the Missouri Compromise did was it drew a line, basically, like politicians so often do. They draw an imaginary line across a map. If you're ever wondering if you can see these lines, this is why the farther you get out west, you notice how the states get boxy? They all start to look like little boxes and cubes, more or less. That's, if you ever see that anywhere in the world, that's a sign of people drawing lines on a map. Because natural borders don't look like that, because they're usually following rivers or forests or mountain ranges, which don't tend to move in straight parallel lines. So when you see that, you know you're looking at something that was done on a map. And in the case of the Missouri Compromise, they basically drew a line along the 36-degree, 30-inch latitudinal line. And they said anything north of any U.S. territory north of that line, when it enters the Union, it's going to enter as a free state. And any U.S. territory south of that line, when it enters the Union, it's going to enter as a slave state. Now, Missouri actually had a little bit of a problem. The tippity top of Missouri actually cuts into the northern part of that line. But the Missouri Constitution was formulated such that they really wanted to enter as a slave state. So they agreed to, so the agreement was made that Missouri would be allowed to enter as a slave state. And this was done because at the same time Maine, which had previously been part of Massachusetts, was now becoming its own state and was entering the Union as a free state. And we begin to see this concern with a sort of balance of power, in that neither the slave states nor the free states wanted to get outnumbered by the other. So there's a sort of tit for tat going on of how many slave states are there, how many free states are there. And this is being done in order to make sure that neither side can overrule the other. Slave states are in constant paranoia that the free states are going to get enough of a majority to try to make slavery illegal. This is why the southern states, one, are constantly trying to get new states to become slave states, and two, as we saw from our previous lessons, they're clinging to a lot of states' rights issues about things like the nullification crisis and things like that, because they're trying to make sure that come hook or come crook, they're going to be able to preserve the institution of slavery. Now, let's talk about the inadequacies of the Missouri Compromise. Well, it might have worked, except we got more land. So after the Mexican-American War, which we talked about in class, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and then with the later addition of the Gadsden Purchase, we acquired what we would now consider the lands of California, Utah, Colorado, Nevada, Arizona, and New Mexico, and Texas. Texas was an earlier addition to the Union, but Mexico formally and finally recognized it in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. But at this point, you have all these states that were not part of the original Louisiana Purchase. And the line, the 36th parallel, only extended up to the eastern slope of the Rockies in the original compromise. So now the issue is, what do we do with these new what they call the Mexican secession, the states that were formerly part of Mexico, now part of the United States? What do we do with them? Are they slave states? Are they going to be free states? How do we handle this? Well, before we get to that, and we're getting there, there's a bit of a blip going on around the same time, and that is the Nat Turner Rebellion. So all this nonsense is going on in Washington. Down in the South, things are getting a little intense. So Nat Turner is one of those fascinating individuals to emerge in the 19th century. Now, in truth, almost all leaders of slave rebellions, whether in modern history or ancient history, are interesting men and interesting characters in their own right, and Nat Turner is no different. So, as a young man, he came to believe in himself as a sort of prophet, and he reported to see visions of some kind. These visions, what caused them, what they were, we really don't have a handle on that as historians. What we do know is he reported in his confessions at the end of his life, before he was executed, that he saw visions, some of which he claimed include visions of white and black spirits in conflict, and he believed it was his destiny to lead a slave revolt against the ruling planter class in the South. So he kept waiting for a sign. Finally, one summer, there was a solar eclipse. And he took the solar eclipse as a sign, but he fell ill. And that put things on hold. And then a second sign occurred. For whatever reason, around this time period, there was historians describe it as an atmospheric disturbance, most likely the result of sun spots or some other type of solar radiation that produced a minor discoloration in the sun and the sky. Think something similar to the aurora borealis. But to people of the 19th century, especially individuals living as slaves, the sun suddenly changing color definitely looks a whole heck of a lot like a sign from above. And Nat Turner took it as such. Admittedly, the sun changing color is kind of freaky. So, he ends up leading a slave revolt. It is not a terribly successful affair. A few families are murdered, about 55 casualties in total among white families. The rebels were very good at catching planters off guard, but they fled before the state militia. And so, again, not much more successful than some of the earlier insurrections we saw. The habit of seeing the army and running away. They're not doing any better than Shays' Rebellion or the Whiskey Rebellion in terms of their capacity to take on even a state militia. So, there's that going for them, which is nice. Anyway, they flee. Ironically, the rebellion actually brings more death upon African, as many Southern planters began to kill almost any African American they even remotely